This podcast comes from the corner of a country lane in the middle of England.
Talk Genealogy, the podcast for genealogists with too much time on their hands.
This month, it's family history within the sound of Bow Bells.
Talk Genealogy podcast looks at different techniques and interesting sources for family historians. Or perhaps a discussion about early genealogists, the pioneers of our science. Sometimes we look at how a famous character in history shows us something particular about genealogy. But hey, most of the time we talk about whatever comes into our head, building an audio library for genealogists with too much time on their hands.
Hello everyone, tonight I'm just going to love sharing with you the fun of researching family history within the sound of Bow Bells. I have not found a better vehicle for learning about life in Old England. If you have a Cockney ancestor, if your branch moved on to America, Canada, South Africa, Australia and New Zealand, or if your family settled in the heart of London from Asia, the Caribbean, the Middle East, or West Africa, or perhaps Wales at the start of the 19th century, get my drift? A Cockney background in one form or another is worldwide.
Recommended by Who Do You Think You Are magazine and featured on BBC Radio. Here is Malcolm Noble's Talk Genealogy podcast, the podcast for the genealogists with too much time on their hands. Here is your presenter, Malcolm Noble.
The familiar chimes of Bow Bells has long been a reminder of home. In fact, during World War II, the BBC's World Service broadcast a recording made in 1936 of Bow Bells to maintain the morale of the fighting troops across the world. As a symbol of that feeling, John Smith, founder of one of the first English settlements and the reputed husband of Pocahontas, still stands there in the courtyard of St Mary le Bow, even though he was never a Cockney. Now, I do want to reassure you, you may think that tonight's podcast is going to be packed with folklore, but I will be pointing out some research avenues opened up by a Cockney ancestry and some opportunities for rather in-depth interpretation, but let's avoid one misinterpretation for a start. St Mary le Bow is quite a different church from Marylebone, where the cricket comes from. Le Bow identifies the church with its impressive interior arches, or bows. Okay, that's sorted. Oh, and don't forget, I am neither a professional nor an expert. I'm an enthusiast like you, who has spent more years than he should have done digging up his family tree so often in the wrong place. And really, these podcasts are no more than me sharing with you some of the lessons that I've learned along the way. And as always, please remember I am talking about ancestor hunting in England. A Cockney is a misshapen egg laid by an immature hen. It was originally used to make fun of Londoners who were not as country wise or rural savvy as the majority of the population. However, Londoners adopted it as a way of showing not only pride in their origin, but the authenticity of their background. As the population became more diverse as East London grew, so the homebred lot wanted to distinguish themselves from the newcomers. The standard was gradually adopted that you needed to be born within the sound of Bow Bells to be a true Cockney, that is, a Londoner. Now, many of the migrant families were, of course, born in the sound of Bow Bells in their second generation, and that shows that it wasn't a term addressed to exclusivity. It was about being proud of where you came from and a certain amount of loyalty and attachment. The Church of St Mary le Bow stands at the junction of Cheapside and Bow Lane, a stone's throw from St Paul's. Now, in the past 100 years, the reach of its bells has shrunk because of the lift in ambient sound, traffic, people and industry, and the proliferation of high buildings. When my father was born in the 1920s, The bells could be heard across North and East London, and even south of the Thames in Southwark, Shakespeare's stomping ground. Now it covers less than a quarter of that area, roughly north only as far as Shoreditch, and in the west it might just about reach Gray's Inn Road. It also includes the eastern parts of the Square Mile. The Square Mile? That's the financial district of the City of London, the Bank of England, the Royal Exchange, etc. We'll return to geography in a moment, but first an interesting bit of trivia. There are no maternity hospitals left within the sound of Bow Bells, so I guess Cockneys will die out in time to come, unless they change the definition, and I hope they won't. Now, for some listeners who are not closely familiar with London, and who can blame them, let's look at a popular atlas. The Thames goes into a deep loop, almost reaching back on itself. This isolates the Isle of Dogs. A little further upstream is London Bridge, and a little further, Blackfriars. A hop and a skip north of Blackfriars is St Paul's Cathedral, the parish church of England. The lot of London in which we are interested is a stone's throw east of St Paul's and stretches further east, almost back to London Bridge. We're interested in the town north of the river as far as Shoreditch. In other words, oranges and lemons, say the bells of St Clement's. I owe you 5 farthings, said the bells of St Martin's. Now, let's just throw some light on those two. Forget about St Martin's in the Field or St Clement's Dane. We are talking about Clement's and Martin's in Eastcheap. St Clement's, Eastcheap and St Martin's, Auger were originally 2 individual parishes. St Martin's was a centre for French Protestants, at least until 1820. The 2 churches are now 1 parish. The registers for St Clement's survive from 1539, which is unusually early, and St Martin's from 1624. When will you pay me? Said the bells of Old Bailey. We are now talking about St Sepulchre without Newgate, across the road, sort of, from the Old Bailey. Parish registers here survive from 1662, and the church is the largest parish church in the City of London. It dates, would you believe, from 1137. I can't believe that's true, but I've checked it out and it is. And incidentally, our old friend John Smith, the explorer, he was buried here in 1633, and he's now got his own window. So when will you pay me, say the bells of Old Bailey. When I grow rich, say the bells of Shoreditch. This is St Leonard's at Shoreditch, the most northerly belfry to pick up the sound of Bow Bells these days. When will that be, say the bells of Stepney? Well, here's the spoiler. Because Stepney is too far east to count as a true Cockney parish these days. It is beyond the sound of Bow Bells. Oh boy, am I going to get into trouble for that. And that brings us to, I do not know, says the Great Bell of Bow. The Great Bell of Bow is 4100 weight and 61¼ inches wide, which surprises me. I thought it would have been bigger than that.
Genealogists with too much time
Over
on their
4
hands.
centuries, from 1469, this used to call people to work and to announce the 9 p.m. curfew, giving rise to a rather unsatisfactory rhyme. Now, I do apologise because I just can't get this one to scan. Here we go. Clerk of the Bow Bell with the yellow locks, for thy late ringing thy head shall have knocks. Children of Cheap, hold you all still, for you shall have the bow bell, ring as you will. I'll tell you what, let's not include that in the Oxford Companion of English Verse. Now, all those churches that we mentioned had churches on the same spot with the same names way back into Chaucer's time. So the 6 farthings that were mentioned, well, they were minted in silver, again back in the 13th century. So there are many versions of this rhyme, but obviously, just by what we've learned today, it has some antiquity. There are at the moment 12 bells at Bow. That has not always been the case. In fact, during much of the church's history, the bells were either silent or not there at all. The bells each have a name, of course. All church bells do.
Genealogists with too much
In this
time on their
case,
hands.
it is Catherine, Fabian, Christopher, Margaret, Mildred, Faith, Augustine, John, Timothy, Pancras, Cuthbert and Bow. It sounds rather like Trumpton's Fire Brigade, doesn't it?
TalkGenealogy.com is the website that supports the podcast for genealogists with too much time on their hands. You find a guide to previous episodes, a list of books mentioned in the series, and now and then, a bit of a blog. Recommended by Who Do You Think You Are magazine and featured on BBC Radio. Here is Malcolm Noble's Talk Genealogy podcast.
One letter is engraved on each of the bells. The first one has the letter D, the second one W, then H, I, the fifth has a T, and the sixth has a T. You get the idea. It spells Dick Whittington. So we better deal with him next. Yes, there was a Dick Whittington. He was a Lord Mayor of London, either 3 or 4 times. The sources vary. He did much good stuff, founding a charity that continues today. And yes, he married Alice Fitzwarren, just as he continues to do every January across the theatres of England. But apparently they had no children. So, unless you know better, there are no direct descendants, male or female, from the man with the cat. There are, however, several lines of descent from his siblings. It is an exhaustively researched family tree. Some of the links are stronger than others, I have to say, and I wonder how many of those 1,000+ descendants have actually sat on Whittington Stone. Well, next to it, you can't actually get to it to sit on top of it. Which brings me to the second point. What about the cat? We've no contemporary evidence that he did have a cat, but the first association has been traced to Elizabeth's reign, and that is only, say, 5 or 6 generations away from Whittington's death. In family tradition terms, that's hardly a tea break. And as you know from our episodes on the Templars, I just love a myth or tradition. Sometime, somewhere, someone probably took elements of Whittington's life and thought that they could be told through the metaphor of a cat and church bells. I think it's rather nice that because he was a champion of the poor, at least in medieval context, the legend adopts him as coming from a poor background. In fact, he came from a very wealthy background. As to the cat, well, I wish I was about to reveal the truth to you, but the answer, no, I'm still looking. There is some uncertainty how far young Dick got in his bid to return home to Gloucestershire. That is, before the Bow Bells called him back. It cannot have been the traditional Whittington Stone at Highgate Hill, because that is too far to reach in one day, And secondly, we doubt that he would have heard the bells, even in 1392. Are we taking all of this just a little too seriously? The most likely site is actually Bun Hill, which is now a disused cemetery. So the bells, Whittington, and not to mention the cat, have given us a colourful landscape on which to bed our research. But the colour gets even richer when we consider the London of Bow Bells. It's on Cheapside, one of the city's oldest thoroughfares. The word cheap relates to a market or a trading area, and takes us back to the days of great King Alfred, let's say 150 years before the conquest. Well, no, actually, it's nearly 200 years before the conquest. Through history, it's been a processional route for royals and dignitaries and general homecomers. And if you think you have an ancestor going back to those times, the medieval times, do check the Medieval Londoners database. That's the search term that will bring it up for you. This is an emerging rather than a complete site, so please give it some support and patience. In medieval London, it was a wealthy area for mobs. Shopkeepers and merchants opened their business along Cheapside and its adjoining lanes, and if we just look at the map, we'll be able to tell what trades were being presented. There's Ironmonger's Lane, Milk Street, Bread Street, Fish Street, Friday Street for fish, Cordwainers. So Cockney London is a grand place for researching about urban occupations. Let's call them trades. Here I want to offer an unsolicited plug for a journal, Cockney Ancestors, which comes from the East of London Family History Society. No, I'm not a member. Do they stick to my definition of a Cockney? Well, I guess the clue's in the title of their organisation. Nevertheless, it contains many interesting articles about the trades and the crafts in London of days gone by, and in that sense it's one of our better newsletter type things. Take a look at it online. Let's pause for a cuppa and browse through the magazine section of the podcast. Where are we?
Here is Malcolm Noble's Talk Genealogy podcast, recommended by Who Do You Think You Are magazine and featured on BBC Radio.
I like to recommend a book, a podcast and a website each month, and this month's book choice is not one but a series of 4. Published by Batsford Books in the 1930s, the Pilgrim's Library is readily available on the second-hand market, and the 4 books provide not only a glimpse of pre-war attitudes and their take on English history, but they also set out those parts of their heritage that, okay, were important to them, but they're important to us as well. The 4 volumes are the beauty of England, the legacy of England, the wildlife and the countryside. I think I'm drawn most to the legacy, with its conversational history of the house, the manor, the farm, the town and the village.
Genealogists with too much time
So
on
together that's the 4 books of the Batsford Pilgrim's Library for this month's book choice.
Malcolm Noble's writing about Cambridgeshire includes Outrage in Balsham, and Cambridgeshire village disturbs its sleeping death. What made this quiet Tudor parish dig up a grave in their country churchyard? One independent reader has said, "Your research and scholarship is impressive, and you have certainly succeeded in setting out the background to life in Balsham." Outrage in Balsham by Malcolm Noble.
The website, well, it's a website with a tutorial video actually, and it comes from Northumbrian Archives. That's the thing to search for. It's on YouTube as well, but it's probably best taken through the Archives website, and they take you through very thoroughly how to use the Memorial Documents Register at TNA, the National Archives. It's good stuff, don't miss it. And okay, for the podcast, I've gone for History Tea Time with Lindsay Holiday. Again, it's on YouTube, and it's a very light-hearted take on a number of history subjects, not always English. I like the rather irreverent look at our history, taken with a mid-Atlantic accent, would you believe? That is History Tea Time with Lindsay Holiday. Each of this month's choice is well worth a few minutes just going through them.
Here's some earlier episodes of the podcast. Episode 15. Let's talk of graves, of worms, of epitaphs. Episode 30 was about the hearth tax. Episode 12, and it was Shakespeare, for example. Episode 9 discussed the medieval pike rolls. Go to episode 7 for the companions of William the Conqueror. Episode 2, the Herald's Visitations. And our very first episode looked at working with Tudor wills. Building an audio library for the genealogists with too much time on their hands.
Hey Malk, what's coming up?
Coming up, that episode on the descendants of Edward III that I've been promising for a few months. That's up next on the schedule. And also from next month, I am going to introduce just a snippet, a little bit of wisdom from one of the old genealogists, mainly from the Tudor period up to the Victorian period. I was going to do a whole episode of it, but I thought you might lose the will to live. So we'll do it just a little bit of a snippet at a time. I'm looking forward to including those, and I hope you'll be with me.
And now, on with the episode.
Fruiterers' Hall, Dyers' Hall, Plumbers' Hall, Vintners' Hall, Parish Clerks' Hall, Bakers' Hall, Fishmongers' Hall, Joiners' Hall, Innholders' Hall, Skinners' Hall, Painters and Stationers' Hall, Blacksmiths' Hall, Woodmongers' Hall, Cordwainers' Hall, Salters' Hall, Cutlers' Hall, Tallow Chandlers' Hall, Clothworkers' Hall, Grocers' Hall, Mercers' Hall, Embroiderers' Hall, Saddlers' Hall. My goodness me. It wasn't long before you would come up against the very powerful trade and merchant guilds. Their role was to, yes, lobby on their own behalf, and they certainly did, but they also maintained standards within their trade, and importantly, they supervised apprenticeships, and in that way contributed to the early education of Londoners. 12 of them became the livery companies of the city, and they are the mercers, the grocers, the drapers, the fishmongers, the goldsmiths, the skinners, the merchant tailors, the haberdashers, the salters, the ironmongers who went back to the early 1100s, would you believe, the vintners and the clothworkers. Many of those and others today carry on their tradition of the charities that were their foundation. Now, much that we know about this part of London is thanks to John Stow, so it seems a good idea that we should conclude this episode of the Talk Genealogy podcast by saying a few words about him. He was born in 1525, we think, the son of a tallow chandler, but he actually enrolled in the Merchant Tailors Guild. He was in his early 20s at that stage, so must have completed an apprenticeship. He eventually settled near the Old Gate Pump, which was an old water source said to mark the beginning of the East End, and also is at the very foot of the Great North Road. Now, there is a story that Old Gate Pump was preferred because of its very clear water, and this was because, so the legend says, that calcium from the bones in the nearby graveyard seeped into the water supply. I'm tried to bottom that out. I can't work out if there's any truth in it or not. Old Gate Pump is of course Cockney rhyming slang for taking the hump. In 1560, Stowe began the work that he's famous for, his Survey of London, which is a bit of a perambulation really, but talks about the people, the places and the life. It took him 30 years to complete, by which time he had assembled a library of manuscripts and documents, a bit like Robert Cotton, I guess, that were the envy or at least respected by many other learned intellectuals of the day. In 1586, he was very much involved in the organisation of the Society of Antiquities. Do you know, we really ought to do an episode on the Society of Antiquities, didn't we?
Don't forget to download the episode if you want it for keeps. We're not monetized, so we can't maintain episodes in the internet forever. Why not think about downloading tonight's talk to your library?
My name is Malcolm Noble, and if you've enjoyed tonight's podcast, then you are the genealogist with too much time on your hands.
The Talk Genealogy podcast is posted at 5 minutes to midnight on the third Thursday of each month. Thanks to Freeze Effects for the music and Momna Yunus and Emily Brooks for the voiceovers. This podcast comes from the corner of a country lane in the middle of England.
I want to thank you for listening to tonight's episode and wish you all the best with your family tree hunting. Good night, Chip, and thanks for listening.